hope that you all have this this handout, this text. If you don't, there are some more copies back here, and you might tell people as they come in, help them to find a copy. My goal here today is to take just some basic terminology, basic categories out of Western ethical thought, in which I am not at all an expert. I was a philosophy major back in my undergraduate years, but that's about it. But I think these categories, we could argue over the definitions, but I'm just using them as sort of heuristic lenses to see a little bit more what's going on in this classic textbook on Usul al-Fiqh by Imam al-Haramayn al-Juwayni, a Shafi'i Ash'ari scholar. So this is a heuristic exercise, and I'm going to take you through, highlight a few things in his text, and tease out what is the significance of the little choices he makes about how to define terms, the exact rules and the structure of Islam. Hoping that will illumine for us what kind of thing he thinks ethics is, or at least he probably had a broader sense of ethics beyond fiqh, but at least what kind of ethical system you think fiqh constitutes. So this text is the Kitab al-Waraqat. It's all over the place. So many commentaries have been written. I've written my own, I drafted my own commentary on this too, actually. And I counted that was commentary number 60 that I could find, but I'm sure there were many more. And then Osama told me the other day that if I go on YouTube, I can find many more whole, 1 month-long courses going through this Kitab al-Waraqat. So it's very influential. Whether al-Juwayni wrote it, some people have disputed, starting very early on. It almost doesn't matter because it's been so influential, and what I'm interested in is what it tells us about the structure of how many Muslims up until today think about fiqh and the kind of ethical system that therefore is implicit in the categories that many Muslims are working with today. The particular text I've given you here is my own reconstruction of an early critical edition done by Ibn al-Fiqh in the 13th century. He had several copies. They were already textual variants, and he was very deliberate about saying, there are different variants, and I think this is what al-Juwayni really wrote. And, so he did his own critical edition, but now I have to reconstruct his edition of different manuscripts. But I didn't give you the critical apparatus. This is just the text, so we can look at it together here, and my own rather free interpretive translation, which I hope is useful. Let's just turn to the first section here, legal science and its roots. This is a book about the roots of legal science. That is a phrase composed of two distinct parts, roots and legal science. Already there's a textual issue. Some of the texts just say, that is composed of two distinct parts. And when I first studied the text, many years ago at Emory University, with Vernon Robbins, a New Testament interpretation scholar, and Gordon Newby, a scholar of Islam and Judaism, and I read this text comparatively, reading at the same time a textbook on Western hermeneutical theories. And that was a very difficult but very productive exercise that helped me understand Usul al-Fiqh in new ways, and I'm hoping that using Western ethical categories will have a similar illuminating effect. But when I first read this text, I just read, here are some pages, that is composed of two distinct parts. What is composed of two distinct parts? The phrase Usul al-Fiqh, the discipline of Usul al-Fiqh, or the book that he's introducing here. And I was puzzled. I think Ibn al-Fiqh is probably right. The text probably said the phrase is composed of two distinct words, and he's now going to define those words. But really his whole book is divided in two, and I just want to make that point. The first half, I think, up through sections 9, I think, you could argue with some preliminaries, and then it's a discussion of the nature of revelation, the stuff, the material of revelation, revealed language, and principles about revealed language. And then the second half is then what are some tools, how do you go about solving interpretive puzzles, and what are the methods for reasoning from the language of revelation to arrive at fiqh. that's already important. The first half focuses on revelation, and so we can already see he's in the divine command theory realm of ethics. He is not a natural law theorist here. The way he defines a root is that on which something else is built, whereas a branch is that which is built on something else. You're familiar probably with the root-branch metaphor, vision of Islamic law, and I just want to tease out for what's significant about the way he's defined root and branch. There are other ways of doing it. You can say, a branch is that which grows off of something else or branches out from something else. The root is that from which something else comes or of which something else is constituted or made. There are other definitions in Usul, but he uses the language of building. And as it starts to make me wonder, it sounds like he thinks fiqh is an edifice that is built through human constructive labor. Is he what we call a constructivist who says that ethical norms are not out there existing? They are rather built up through a process of deliberation. We'll come back to that question. But just contrast the tree metaphor and the building metaphor. And think about the significance of his choosing the building metaphor, even though his language of root, and particularly when you insert a branch, root can mean a lot of things, awesome. But branch really suggests a tree. Is the law something that sort of grows organically out of revelation, in the sense that the fruit on the tree, the fruit of interpretation, is already kind of predetermined by the DNA of the plant as an organic thing? Or no, he says, this is something that is built by diligent inquiry. It is quite literally a human construct. Fiqh is a human construct, built by ijtihad. And then he defines legal science, which is just my translation for fiqh. Here is awareness of the revealed legal values that are arrived at by diligent inquiry. Al-Ash'ari, Abu Hasan al-Ash'ari defined fiqh as understanding the meaning of the speaker as it relates to law. Here, that would suggest that a greater focus on revelation, and the fiqh is just understanding revelation. Here, al-Juwayni again presents fiqh as something more that is built up by human reasoning, by his definition. Legal science is just knowledge arrived at by diligent inquiry. Jumping down to the next section here. There are 7 legal values, of which the first 5 are basic. I think valid and invalid can be sort of supplementary ones that you can, if you say something is valid, that just gives you more information about which actions are obligatory and which, if your prayer was valid, then prayer is no longer obligatory for you. So those are kind of secondary ahkam, but his basic structure defines things in terms of those 5 legal values, ahkam. Just note the fact that people have often note the fact that there are recommended and disapproved in here indicate that this is an ethical system. It includes should as well as must. But okay, notice more importantly that how these are defined. Obligatory means one is rewarded for doing and punished for omitting. All the others are defined that way as well. This, I think you could argue easily, that he needs a reward in the afterlife. So the fiqh is to know the legal value of an act you perform. And to know the legal value means to know whether you'll be rewarded or punished for it in the afterlife. Okay? So it's about fiqh is about consequences, but it's not a consequentialist ethic. A consequentialist ethic normally means you're interested in the consequences in this life and the consequences that your actions have for those around you. Here, it's very individualistic. It's the consequences my actions have for me. Now, that's not that fiqh is, egocentric or it's not an egoist ethical theory. I mean, you look at the rules, immensely, often favor the welfare of the community even over the benefit of the individual. So it's not an egoist ethic. But nevertheless, it's striking the way al-Juwayni defines fiqh here is as a matter of individual responsibility to God. This is not, it's not some kind of social contract ethic, right? You can imagine an Islamic social contract ethic, and there were, the only thing you could think of others, maybe we can discuss some others. I thought of Ibn Sina and his notion that prophethood and the reign of law is necessary for the sake of the cohesion of the community. And if you think that the purpose of law is the cohesion of the community, you have a very different notion of ethics. Here the purpose of law is my individual happiness in the afterlife. It's not utilitarian in the classic sense, because utilitarian means maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain for everybody. But this is utilitarian in a very individualistic sense. From these definitions, I want to just throw out a couple of ethical terms. From these definitions, we can see that al-Juwayni's ethic is, first of all, what we call deontic. Second, it's more specifically deontological. And third, it's an agent-centered deontic ethic. So by deontic, that just means it's an ethic about what one ought to do. Deon apparently is Greek for duty. Now, that's duh, right? Ethics is about what you ought to do. No, not duh, actually. There are other possibilities. Virtue ethics. It's not about what you ought to do, it's about the kind of qualities you ought to have as a person, right? And we can imagine virtue ethics. We've already talked about that. Fiqh. What would fiqh look like? If you, Usul al-Fiqh here, you define not what I ought to do, but what I ought to be like. Fiqh would be not knowledge of whether I will be punished for a certain act or reward. It would be, fiqh would be the attainment of certain qualities. And instead of ahkam, degrees of reward and punishment, it would sort of degrees of attainment of virtue. And so what you would get out of fiqh would be statements like, to know fiqh, the kind of knowledge you would have would be knowledge that this person has attained this degree of generosity or something like that. That's how you'd have to define your terms. Whereas here, okay, how is it defined? Fiqh is knowledge of the legal values of actions. And he's presenting a system where knowledge, the whole discipline, is about knowing for this particular action, by this, and defined very particularly for this person or type of person at this time and place under these circumstances. Think like a mathematician, draw a Venn diagram. There's this enormous set of all people, set of all circumstances, set of all actions, set of all times, all places. And you do kind of a cross product of all those, all the possible combinations. For every one of those combinations, you can map it in a Venn diagram into this tiny little set with 5 items in it. Each one of those things you map on. And so fiqh is knowledge of which hukm is assigned to which person, act, time, circumstance combination. So it always takes the form. This act by this person in this place at this time has this legal value, will be rewarded or punished for it. That's the form of it. You would have to do a virtue ethic that was not about what you should do and what will be rewarded and punished. You'd have to define your terms quite differently. And there are resources for virtue ethics, right? We've talked about akhlaq. What would the roots of legal science be if law was a virtue ethic? Would it be God's grace? Or would it be certain practices by which you cultivated virtue? I mean, you just have to define the terms very clearly. Okay, it's deontological. Not all deontic ethical systems are deontological. I take it that means deontological system is one in which there are obligations and prohibitions governing the agent. And the reason you have to do something is because it's obligatory or prohibited for you. That's different from, say, a consequentialist ethic like utilitarianism, in which it is about what I should do, but it's not about obligations govern me. It's about the consequences of my acts for others. Here, it's only about the individual consequences for me in the afterlife. That's not the normal sense of consequentialist. Here it's just eternal consequences, what God has said he will reward or punish in the afterlife. So notice also here, this is not exactly a strong realist system. A realist system of ethics would say the moral value of an act is actually a property of that action. Now here he is saying actions have properties. Each act has a hukum. But the hukum is really just God's statement that he will reward or punish it. It's not an intrinsic property of the act itself. Now you can imagine a more realist ethic. Certainly some of the Mu'tazila said there are actual properties of actions, and God's commands then reflect the properties of actions. But here this is more voluntarist divine command theory, in which the legal value simply is God's commandment. Just one other point, another way in which this differs from utilitarianism. Think about all the discussion we've had about maslahah recently. Maslahah, an ethical system like Jossem's, focused on maslahah, would be more consequentialist. But and here's an interesting, I should have asked Jossem out of this. How can you make Islamic law so consequentialist when the basic definition of the hukum, the basic definition of what law is to know whether I individually will be rewarded or punished? That consequentialism. Yes, you can incorporate maslahah as a source of law, but the whole system is geared toward the personal consequences for me, not the consequences for society. So, just suggesting that if maslahah, if some people are resistant to making maslahah the dominant thing the dominant concern in fiqh, there are reasons why there's resistance to that. The system is not set up to accommodate that. Okay. Finally, it's agent-centered. It's an obligation for me toward God. It's not, the alternative would be a patient-centered system of obligations, which would say my obligations are based not in my responsibility to God or something like that, but in the rights of others. So it would talk, a patient-centered ethical theory would say not I am obligated to do X, it would say the person out there has a right for me to treat him or her in this way. And okay, we've been talking about rights. Okay, human rights discourse. How well is that going to fit into this dominant paradigm of what fiqh is? Well, it's going to fit uncomfortably, because that would be a patient-centered ethical theory, and here we have a very agent-centered ethical theory. The obligations are focused on the agent. It's not that there aren't resources in Islamic thought, or even in Islamic law, for a rights-based ethic. The huquq al-ibad, which didn't really come up enough the other day, but we need to get back to that in relation to Wise's presentation. That notion is there, but it's the fundamental structure is not rights-centered, it's obligation-centered. Okay, more than halfway through, and we're done with the first page. But that's okay, because you know how you usually pass, if you read Usul al-Fiqh, you usually jump over these definitions, you skim through them. And I just hope you're seeing here, there's an awful lot presumed, packed into these definitions, that not only gives al-Juwayni's vision of fiqh a certain shape, it also explains to us why certain other visions, rights-based, maslahah-based, are going to be difficult to fit easily into that way of thinking about law. So they're extremely important, these definitions. Knowledge and its opposites, category 3 on the next page. Again, legal science is a kind of knowledge. It's knowing facts about actions. This is not about virtues or social contract. It's just knowing facts about what will be rewarded and punished. The ahkam, those facts exist out there. They're not. It's knowing the thing as it actually is. That makes it sound like the act has an intrinsic property. Here, we know he's not saying that. He's just saying knowing that in fact the act has this property of having been commanded by God, and God has said he will reward or punish him. When in the next section here is just a table of contents of what he's going to do. Again, he divides the discipline into two parts. There's the roots of legal science are the paths to it in section 4. And then he's also going to consider the manner of using those paths in evidentiary inquiry. So we'll have to come back again He's breaking it into revelation and then the tools for constructing fiqh out of revelation. We'll have to come back to it. Is he in any sense a constructivist who thinks that law is actually, that ethics is actually constructed by human beings? I think our answer is going to be no. What we're constructing here is fiqh. It's our knowledge of legal values. We're not constructing the legal values themselves. So our interpretive labor is just that. The construction of law is an interpretive labor. It's not a rational labor that just discerns or creates the moral properties of actions. We can, just a few highlights to look at in the next few sections here. Okay, this is important. Section 5, types of speech. He's got to define speech because we're talking about revelation, right? And this language, divided into command, prohibition, statement, and question. Yeah, that seems obvious. He could have added a few more. He knows that. But the basic point is, speech does not all do the same thing. Speech does different kinds of things. Why is that important? Well, in the next section, he goes into command and prohibition in particular. Okay, and notice, so why does he have to go into command and prohibition? He's going to tell us how to translate commands and prohibitions into fiqh. And remember, translating it into fiqh means translating it into not commands and prohibitions, but statements. Statements, this act by this person at this time has this legal value. So interpretation is going to be this interpretive exercise. So how do you translate commands? Well, he defines a command as a verbal request obliging an inferior to perform an act. A command, so the command is the act of requesting. The imperative, the imperative verb, indicates that there is a command existing, subsisting in God. Since he's an Ash'ari, he thinks God's speech, the actual request, subsists in God as an attribute of God. But there's an imperative verb in the Quran that indicates that there is an act of requesting, subsisting in God. And so we have to translate these imperative verbs as indicating obligations unless there's some other evidence. And we can, so if you have an imperative, you can come up with a statement about an obligation. But you can also come up with several other statements that he goes into on the next page here. You can say that it's a command to pray, let's say, but it's also a command to perform wudu if you need to, because it's a command to perform the act and whatever is required for completion of the act. So you can translate the command into two statements. You can also translate it into the statement that you are then released from the charge laid upon you. So that if you pray, you will have discharged your obligation and it will no longer be obligatory, that prayer. So you can get, so this whole enterprise, as he sets it up, is one of translating commands, and really any type of revealed language, into statements about the legal values of acts. And prohibitions, similarly, you can get that it's obligatory to omit the act, which means the act is forbidden, the act is also invalid, that's another separate statement. So the Quran here, and all of Revelation, is being translated into, reduced to a statement of law. Abdul Aziz was talking the other day about wanting a more Quranic ethical vision. And I'm trying, you think about the language of the Quran. How much of the language of the Quran is just statements about this, about law? There's all this language about, there's promise and threat, there's stories, there's examples, there's entreaty, there's all these different kinds of Quranic language. This vision of law says that has to be reduced all to statements of legal values. And in my dissertation research, I came across a clear statement by al-Qadi Abdul-Jabbar that really statements about the legal values of actions is the only kind of information the Quran can convey to us humans. It cannot convey any other kind of information, which is stunning. He's reduced the entire Quran and all its richness and all its different moral shades and all its persuasiveness to statements. Act A by person P at time T has legal value B. So just when you see that that's what's going on in the discourse, that I hope that you can see the alternatives, right? You could look at the Quran as say, what would this Quranic language do? Sometimes when God speaks, it creates, right? It doesn't just inform you of a legal value; it creates. You could have an ethic that focuses on the relationships of authority and loyalty and commitment and responsibility between individuals. You could say that Quranic language brings about moral relationships and creates them performatively. But al-Juwayni is saying no, it's not performative speech. It doesn't bring about a new situation or a new relationship. It just informs you about reward and punishment. You could say that the language of the Quran transforms people's character. Right? You could say that the language of the Quran is a sort of existential challenge. These all have something appealing about them, and they resonate with the language of the Quran, right? But al-Juwayni, within his system, he's going to have us reducing. Now, al-Juwayni would probably read the Quran in those ways too. But for this dominant paradigm, and we've seen this is the dominant paradigm for understanding Islamic ethics. It's sort of the one discipline, fiqh, that sort of hangs over everybody's discussion of ethics. And that Jasser, for instance, wants to incorporate all of ethics within a modified version of this paradigm. He's going to have to modify it quite a bit to get to get a very different vision. And you can imagine some other ways of interpreting Quranic language, not just reducing it to statements about legal values. And then, to section 7, he goes into general and particular expressions. Particularization is to distinguish part of the whole. That's a key thing. At the end of this section 7, he says the book can be particularized by the book by the sunnah, sunnah by the book, sunnah by the sunnah. An utterance, any of those texts can be particularized by an analogy. He's a Shafi'i. Anything particularizes anything. Okay. And he'll say later, if you've got, when he deals with how do you deal with conflicts in revelation, if of your conflicting texts, which is a major the crux of legal theory, if you've got conflicting texts, well, if one's general and the other's particular in some way, it's easy to reconcile them. The particular one trumps the general, particular. Okay. Again, just think, this is defining the logic of Islamic law. And you compare this to the way we've been trained in the West to think, in the sort of Greek philosophical tradition. We think in terms of universal principles and truths, and the particular cases we expect are going to line up under the universal principles. So if all bachelors are male and Socrates is a bachelor, then Socrates is male. That's the law. And so when I've seen sometimes Western human rights people talking about general principles of human rights, and they'll tear their hair out because they don't understand why a Muslim can say, oh yes, there's a general principle of freedom of religion, and yet some will say conversion is not permitted. You say, well, how does that fit under the general principle? Well, according to al-Juwayni, particular exceptions trump general principles. Whereas, in the Greek philosophical tradition, we used to say, no, if you're going to be consistent, your particular cases have to line up with your general principles. Whereas for al-Juwayni, consistency doesn't mean that. Consistency means if you've got conflicting texts in Revelation, you have to show they're actually consistent. And to do that, you have to make one trump the other, and the particular trumps the general. It's a very different notion of what it means to be consistent and coherent. You can see why sometimes there's a little miscommunication between people coming out of different, really different logics. Well, we're just about out of time. I should probably just make one more point in the last section here. Boy. Well, there's lots you could say in each of these sections. The last section, Khalid Abul Fadl, in his book, Speaking in God's Name, argues that al-Juwayni was one of the Musawwada, those who said every jurist who performs ijtihad to the best of his ability and is qualified is correct. That would make al-Juwayni, I think, that's the one way in which al-Juwayni might be a constructivist. Because if God says, hey, the law is whatever you're going to come up with through this interpretive process, that's a constructivist. I think you can see at the end here, he gives a proof for why the Musawwada are wrong. So he's not, in this text, he's not presenting that position. He's more of a realist in that sense. Once God has commanded things, actions have their legal values, and that's it. We don't construct them. But there are resources for constructive ethics. The Musawwada are an example of how an Islamic legal ethic could be constructivist. And I was also, I'll just, if you'll give me one extra minute here, there's also a certain existentialist kind of ethic, Abu Fadl's vision in particular. And for the Musawwibah, I think this is a little bit true. What matters is the integrity of your decision making. It's did you make that interpretive choice with integrity and to the best of your ability, exerting all your effort. That has an existentialist resonance to me. It's the integrity of your fact is that you make a choice, you take responsibility for it, and you make it with integrity. And so I was imagining, what would an existentialist Islamic ethic look like? And the image that came to mind was, well, you drank beer last night. That was spineless sellout to peer pressure. That was, on an existentialist ethic, that's bad. That's not an authentic choice. But if you drank beer because you were joining a protest with a bunch of Christian laborers who don't mind, Presbyterian laborers who don't, oppressed and who don't mind drinking beer and who are oppressed, and you're standing in solidarity with them, so you would drink beer. On this existentialist ethic, that's a good thing, right? That's a very good thing. Okay, so you can imagine there are different ways of evaluating actions, right? And for Abu Fadl, to some extent, it's the integrity of your process, the authenticity of your process. And there are resources for that in the Islamic tradition, but not in al-Juwayni. And remember, Fiqh is such a dominant paradigm for ethics, and al-Juwayni's text is such a widespread, just taken for granted set of categories for thinking about fiqh. But well, I hope seeing a little bit of what's implicit in his text gives you a little more insight into his thinking and why fiqh is the way it is today. But I hope it's also stimulated your imagination a little bit into what it might take, the kind of radical reformulations it might take if, like Jasper Auda, you want to have a new kind of ethical theory that's nevertheless within the language of fiqh. You have to redefine a few key terms.